I read a lot. So I think this is like, how do I become a good writer? Well, you have to read a ton before you ever become a good writer. And I think before you can become a good storyteller, you need to know what makes a good story. But I try to obviously read a lot. I also try to follow some particular podcasts that I really enjoy in terms of the quality of storytelling, especially from a Christian perspective. Those are the kinds of things I do. So I read a ton, and I try to follow podcasts that have sort of that story quality.
This is Season 4, Episode 5 of the Missional Marketing Podcast. My name is Bart, Blair, and it is my privilege to welcome you to the 129th episode of our show. We produce this podcast to help your church grow by leveraging digital marketing and effective communications. We know that you have a lot of podcast options, different choices that you could be listening to, and the fact that you tune into this show means the world to us. Thanks so much for being a loyal, faithful listener, follower, whatever you want to call it, if that is what you are. If you happen to be new, maybe this is the first time you've tuned in. If you haven't yet subscribed, make sure that you do that on whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, make sure that you subscribe and ring the bell so that you don't miss any future episodes. And you know what? If you're enjoying the show, we'd love to get some feedback from you. Make sure that you leave us a rating or a review wherever you are listening to the show. And if you're watching on our YouTube channel, we always post a question at the top of the comments section of the YouTube video, and we'd love to just dialogue with you there. Scroll down, read that question, give us an answer, let us know what you think. We'd love to engage with you on that platform. This week, we are really excited to be sharing an interview that my co-host Jason Hamrock and I recently did with a guy named Rob James, who serves at a church in Fort Worth, Texas, not too far from where I live, called Doxology Bible Church. Doxology is a multi-campus church serving in Fort Worth. Phenomenal team there, just an amazing church. For the first time I actually had an opportunity to visit a year and a half ago, I think, I just saw this church is doing some amazing things well in terms of making an impact in their community for Jesus. And the last time I was actually there on site working with one of my colleagues who happens to work with the Doxology team there and their creative team, I had an opportunity to sit in on a meeting with Rob James, who is the lead storyteller at Doxology. What is a storyteller, you might ask? Well, Rob's going to share with us today in this interview what he gets to do in ministry. And it's really awesome. It's really exciting. It's really encouraging. And it's given me a lot of things to think about just in terms of my own ministry, my own church, and the things that we may be able to do to tell more stories, to just affirm the impact that a relationship with Jesus and being connected in a local church can make in someone's life. I think you're really going to enjoy the podcast. I really hope you enjoy it as much as Jason and I enjoyed doing the interview with Rob. Before I hand things over to Jason and the interview that we did with Rob, I just want to remind you that once a month now, we are doing a podcast episode called Burning Questions. That's what it's called. I was going to say hot takes. It's not hot takes. It's burning questions. And we've been receiving some questions from some of you that we're going to answer in these podcast episodes. If you'd like to send in a question for one of the upcoming episodes of the Burning Questions episodes, you can email those to me at bblair@missionalmarketing.com. Just put in your subject line, question for the podcast or podcast question. I'll be happy to add that to our list. And then in the next episode, Jason and I will actually be surprising each other with which questions we're going to choose to ask. And maybe one of your questions will be one of the ones that we ask. So make sure that you send those in. If you've got a burning question, we would love to be able to answer those for you. Well, I'm going to keep this show moving. So here, without any further delay, is the CEO of Missional Marketing, Jason Hamrock, and our interview with Rob James from Doxology Bible Church.
Well, hey, Rob, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I am doing great. Given the heat and the craziness of Texas, I'm doing great.
Yeah, we're finishing August here for all our viewers, heading into September. But for some of us, like I'm in Phoenix and Rob's in Texas, he'll explain where he is. So is Bart. It's still hot, but hey, we're going to be turning the corner real soon. I'm excited for the fall. So, but hey, so glad to have you on the show. I'm really, really excited about our conversation today. This is going to benefit a lot of churches.
Yeah,
I love this because I talk to churches all the time about what we're going to talk about. before we get into our topic of the conversation, why don't you give us a little background on who you are, what church you're with, and just tell us a little bit about your story.
Sure. My name is Rob James. I am the Ministry Storyteller here at Doxology Church in Fort Worth, Texas. And
Ministry Storyteller.
I know it's a real thing.
How did that happen?
By accident, really. Interestingly, I actually had applied for a production arts position here. And the more I was talking to our creative director about my background in literature and writing, literally storytelling, I homeschooled my kids forever. And that's a natural component, especially when they're young. And we just started talking about spinning stories and, what are some of the things that you see on social media and with other churches. And it became clear that I didn't really have the background for production at all. And I did have enough background in storytelling and what makes a good story and why it's so important, especially in the Christian ministry, that it really just sort of became a thing on its own. And we created a position, and here I am.
Here you are. Okay. All right. Let's dive into this one, because I think, and this, again, I have talks with churches all the time, and I'm always telling them stories of what God is doing in the people in your church. And you should have an abundant amount of stories, because if you're an active, growing church and God's in it, lives are being changed, right? So that's just right. A natural conversation. It's like, yeah, we agree, Jason. And they're going, how do we capture these stories? I'd love to hear from you. Teach us how you are doing your job. And then we'll pivot to actually, the outcome and what you do with those stories. But just tell us what's the formula?
Yeah. Well, so you understand, there really is no formula. That's the secret. It really is probably the most difficult thing, I think, in ministry as a business. How do you measure return on investment in telling a story? How can I prove that I'm changing hearts and minds or leading someone closer to Christ by telling a story? And that's been, I think, the biggest hurdle for us to overcome. But the way I do it is I try to take traditional stories that we would normally tell. And so when I first started, I would be back in the studio recording a testimonial. Okay, typical church storytelling. And I would talk to somebody for 45 minutes, knowing that I had 2.5 minutes max to tell this rich, amazing story about somebody's life. And I would just sit there loving good books, thinking, this is crazy. We just tossed the whole story on the floor, right, for that 2.5 minutes in production that we have on Sunday. What are we doing here? So I try to... My question was a little bit non-traditional, and it was, now, how do we take the real story and then get that shared out to other people? So things that we do now, not necessarily that a church podcast is not traditional, but I think the way we use it is a little bit different. So I try to take those things and use them on social. When I say things, the leftovers, right, to those stories on social media in what we call vision stories. I try to use those bigger stories then in formats like podcasts and so on. Yeah.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about how you're actually capturing. How does Doxology Bible Church work with the ministries to be able to actually know what kind of who has a story to tell?
Yeah, you have to know people. So I came here when I first applied for this position. I had been at the church for a while as a member, and then in community groups and so on. So I know who to ask for those stories. And then I know that I have the support of the ministry staff, pastors, and so on to help point me in the right direction. And then it's really a matter of just talking to those people, just being okay. And it's kind of a generational thing, just being okay to go shake hands, have a seat, grab some coffee. I heard this story. I heard something about something going on in your life. Let's just talk about it. And then from there, I can tell, oh, this would be a great microblog. This would be, we've got a good hour of content here. Let's go podcast. This is interesting, and it would be visual, so we can go, shorter form video for social media and so on.
Okay. So when you say you're working with the ministries, do they understand the power of stories? Because I mean, ministry people, they're just so busy doing their job and programming and stuff. How have you had to work with them to kind of get them to understand the
Yeah.
significance?
Yeah. So everyone knows stories are important. I think most people don't really know why they're important. Everyone can tell you there's some scripture somewhere that says, make sure and go out, go forth, go into the nations, go into the neighborhood and tell your story. But we don't really know. And right. So I've told my story. Now what? And it's really been more of a slow play for me to go intentionally around to pastors, have a seat, and we talk a little bit, about the fact that, people are broken and we're kind of misfits and we don't always belong. And there's so much hesitation there to share that story that I really need that support from you and the ministries that you're involved in to help remind people that, what you're going through right now will help so many people who are struggling with the same thing, but maybe they have shame or guilt about what they're going through and aren't really willing to share yet. And that's just enough of a needle, that support through ministry, that I can usually get enough contacts with people and we can go from there.
Yeah.
But it does have to be intentional. It has to be consistent on a really regular basis. I'm sitting down with those pastors and having that discussion.
Mm-hmm. That's key.
Yep.
It's consistent. It's not like, well, once a year I ask them for a story. No, it's you're building a relationship with the ministries. So you have consistency on gathering those what we call maybe a lead, right? So you can do something with it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I think, I'm going to make a generalization here, but I think by and large, most people in most churches, they come in knowing what their own brokenness is, what their own hurts and their hangups and their challenges are. Mm-hmm. And they sit in a seat on a Sunday morning and they sing the songs with the other people and they listen to the sermon with the other people. And they assume that their path in life is different than everybody else's in the room. Yeah. And right. when the church experience is all monologue, when everything is coming from the platform, from the pastor, from the worship leader, the worship team, mm-hmm. It doesn't give people, I think, the permission to be as transparent as they need to be to get the help in the areas of life where a lot of times they need the help. Yeah. And by being like you're using, it sounds like, and I want to dive into this here shortly. I'll let Jason sort of take the lead on where we go with that. But you've talked about blogs, you've talked about videos, you've talked about podcasting. You're using multiple forms of media to distribute the stories that you're telling. And so I think that when your audience is able to hear those stories on a consistent basis, number one, they hear that other people in the church struggle with some of the same things that I do. Yeah. But secondly, I'm also recognizing that there are actually solutions to my problems, either through a ministry in the church or just a deeper walk with Jesus. And that's something that I can step into here in the context of this church. So that I love that. I just wanted to kind of throw that sidebar in there just to encourage you.
No, that's great.
What I've often told churches is, a pastor or worship leader gets on stage, they're paid to talk to you about why you should do what you should do. But but to me, there's a little bit of hope in that. But when I hear, another couple went through what we're going through, or somebody went through the struggle I'm going through, and I see that there's answers, there's a lot more hope in that because I can see myself in that story. And that's that's, I think, in my opinion, that's like the power of the story. Yeah. And that's what Jesus, it's all about relationship.
Yep. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's why when I first tried to think through the approach, again, there's not a great template for how the storyteller role works in the church, other than the fact that we all sort of do it. But how to make this sort of an actual fundamental part of the church business, that was actually difficult because I couldn't really find a good template for how that worked. And just knowing the way people work, especially, I will say, I don't know that I understand churches in the Midwest. I understand churches in Texas really well. And especially in Texas, there's a facade a lot of times that churchgoers have. And that facade is really hard to penetrate. And the facade is, I come into church and I'm here because I know my kids need to go to church and I need to be here, and I'm coming in problem free. And I want to make sure everyone around me knows that I'm problem free. Well, getting those people to share in public on social media or in a podcast is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to take the approach that this is a long process. This is not, I'm going to start and 3 months later, we have this fantastic, sharing going on all around the church. I hope it happens. But I try to, what I call micro nudge people in that direction. And if that's just the tiniest little reminder, here's why we're sharing. And I do a lot of these stories on the social media where there's a story wrapped around a message. And the message is, here's why we share. Here's why you're not more broken than someone else. Here's why someone who is broken and is afraid to also accept that or share needs to see that you're broken. And this is really important. We are a church of broken people on purpose. And it's so important for us to share and not be so clean, when we walk through the door.
Oh, that is so you said something. I really like that phrase. You are micro moving. You're just constantly challenging, and you have to, and I love the fact that there's a position that Doxology has seen the value of storytelling.
Yeah.
That they've actually put somebody in charge of it. Yeah. Often it gets delegated to a comms team or maybe worship, that they got to go find stories. And there's not a lot of attention to that. Yet it is probably one of the most powerful things. Would you agree to this? That it's one of the most powerful things you can do as a church is to let people relate to what other people are going through.
It's everything to the church. I mean, that's how important it is. And that's how I think how little we understand about how important that really is. It's everything. We don't turn up discipleship or anything like that if everyone is, again, I use the word clean, just meaning I don't have those problems. I don't have that shame. I don't have that guilt, or maybe I have so much shame I don't want to share. But we don't really get through to people on that next level without story. Just all there is to it.
Yeah.
Rob, can we talk a minute about Doxology, the church as a whole, and how the church came to a place where prioritizing storytelling came to the forefront? I mean, it warrants a staff position. I think a lot of churches, number one, they're asking the question, where do we get the stories? How do we use the stories? Where do we distribute the stories? And there's a technical aspect of that. But from a philosophical standpoint, give us some framework for Doxology and how you believe that Doxology came to a point of making this such a high priority.
Yeah. I mean, I think it really is in our DNA. We've been around for a long time, since 1954. And really the church, our beginnings are we want to be in the front yard. We want this to be a portable, simple message. It's open-handed. We're not going to shame you or be in your face or anything. And the way we conduct ourselves as a church, the way we put ourselves into the neighborhood and the community, lends itself to a philosophy that storytelling makes sense. Not that we've ever really done that, because nobody really does. But when it comes to somebody being open, in my case, our communications and creative director, that's Cameron, was open enough to say, you know what, this really is part of our DNA. Storytelling is part of our DNA. We need to do better and expand that sort of natural, important role that we have as Christians. Let's just make this position a thing and run with it. But it wouldn't happen without the DNA of the church.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's got to start from the leadership on down, right?
Yep.
It's just got to be integrated. You also said something that I want to kind of dive into. This is probably going to be really helpful for churches. Hope it is. But you said, hey, I just want to have a conversation, right? So maybe this is a really good tactic. So you meet somebody and you just want to have a conversation, and are you recording them in like in your studio, or do you go outside? Where do you go when you're having conversations?
Yeah, I try to meet them. So this is what I think, being a stay-at-home dad for so long, like I did, and homeschool my kids, I really had to learn. It was not my comfort zone. I had to learn how to meet people where they are. And that really is, I can't really get through to my 14-year-old, for example, if I don't play video games. So whatever bias we have about video games, that's just kind of where he's at. So I have to know to do that. So with people, I think there's a wisdom that comes with this kind of role. You have to understand people. You have to understand people of different generations, how to communicate with somebody that's in high school versus how to communicate with somebody in the later stages of life. I have to know where to go. And that could be a coffee bar. That could be, that could be here at the church, in the offices. That could be over the phone. It could be by text. I have to be open to just about anything. And that's part of that pre-qualification I do when I talk to somebody initially. Yeah.
Okay. So you have this pre-qualification meeting and you kind of use the visual. I'm a visual guy of we just throw it all on the floor.
Yeah, that's right.
You're like, sometimes there may be more open than not, but they're just talking and you're going, whoa, you are then determining, oh, this is going to be great for, a minute and a half weekend service, or this is going to be great for podcast or something in between. Is that, have you figured out the different mediums where you're going to push this content?
Yeah, I do. When I talk to somebody initially, I have to think a lot about where does this story have value? Who does it have value for? What ministry would this apply to? Who in the congregation is probably suffering through the same thing in the case that it's, that deep. So I do that. I do a lot of that. And sometimes I feel like, should I be doing that? But of course I should be. I feel kind of bad, like I'm a car salesman or something. And so I'm, watching a really heartfelt testimonial or something. And I'm thinking, oh yeah, we could really use that as a podcast. Oh, that would be great short form video. I could chop that up into 25 different, shorts. And so I feel kind of bad, but you do have to do that because the story has value only if people see it. And if I haven't figured out a great way to show that, then I haven't really done my job. So, yes.
So then you're obviously capture notes, and then do you invite them into the studio then to get on camera?
No, I don't ever start with camera. So I had a photography studio for about 15 years, and I get it. There is so much anxiety for people around film or that's my age. So around being on the other side of a camera. But that's the traditional way of doing it, right? Hey, come into the studio and we're going to film your testimony. Well, 50% of the people just said no. Mm-hmm. No matter how bad they want to share, they do not want to. I'm not getting on the other side of a camera. So I get it. And the introverts like me also probably not going to want to share. They're going to want to share in another way. And the way they want to share is I'll sit with a microphone in my face as long as you and I are eye to eye and we have a long conversation that's drawn out and it's detailed and I can tell that you're interested in the problems that I've had, but it's hard to do that in 3 minutes. You know what I mean? On a scripted format. So I tend to shy away from anything involving a camera unless I can tell that that's actually something that would be valuable. And I know that they're going to be willing to do that.
Wow.
It limits me, if that makes sense.
So you're doing this full time?
No, I actually part-time.
Part-time? Okay.
It's really full time, but I kind of tithe back the rest.
Okay. How many hours a week are you spending? Let's put it that way.
Well, trying to decide if I should say. I mean, it's probably full-time-ish.
So full-time.
I don't clock that many hours.
How many people are you actually talking to on any given month?
How many people?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know, probably 20 or so. Yeah, sometimes more, sometimes less.
Yeah, but think about that, church. Right now, everyone listening to my voice is going, oh my goodness, 20 a month? We're like we get 20 a year over 2 years.
Yeah, well, that's because you're going at it thinking, who can I talk to for this sermon bumper? You know what I mean? And it has to be deep and I have to be able to wrap it up with a bow. And it has to be a testimonial that has a beginning and an end, as if those actually even exist. And so as a church, we limit ourselves to this tiny, tiny little fragment of stories when we could be opening ourselves up to so much more.
Mm.
Yeah.
So let me double click on that then. So what you're saying is a lot of the stories that you're gathering, collecting, and retelling don't have tidy Jesus storybook endings to them? Like
Shocking.
they're not all, yeah. Like so. Give us some framework for that. What do some of these stories look like? Help us understand what kind of stories you're going after, and frame that for us.
I mean, here's an example. Let's say pastor comes to me and says, we need a good dark to light story. And it's a story about a woman who has recently lost her husband from cancer. And she's had to learn, after a lifetime of living with that paradigm, how do I do that? Right? How do I live outside of that? And the light is, well, I poured myself back into the scripture, and I got myself into a women's group or something like that. And then, you know what I mean? You can hear the sermon film in your mind right now. The music is crescendoing up, and we've got this, this great, amazing, and it is, for that moment in time, is an unbelievable, amazing testament to the power of Christ. I am thinking, okay, and then now what? Because life doesn't work that way, nor should it, nor did God ever promise us to have this clean, wrapped up testimonial life, and then no problems follow. And so I purposely try to follow up with people that have done stories, especially powerful ones like that, 6 months to a year later, and just make sure, just ask, how's your life going? What's happening to you? And here's an example. A woman I'd done a similar story for, a year later was diagnosed with cancer. And so was now struggling through that journey with, her children and so on, in a completely new story, and her new recognition of how she needed to actually pour in even more than she had poured in before into her faith. So the stories just continue. That's our life. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. I bet we probably don't do that. We probably just move on to the next thing we need to get to. Going back to the people that were open to share their story, God's not done.
No, God is never done. And I would say that I think the typical response from pastoral staff, and there's nothing wrong with this, because they're thinking of it in terms of, well, haven't we already told that story? Or, or people were in this service a year ago, for example, and they already saw this story. What would be new? Because that's the paradigm I don't understand. We've baptized somebody, right? We had awesome, beautiful music in church. We baptized them. Isn't that the end? I was like, no, of course not. That's never the end. That's just sort of the beginning. Now with the fun stuff happens.
Yeah, the start. That's such a good conversation. Okay, give me some ways that what would you do to encourage people that are hearing you right now that go, yeah, we just don't do a very good job. Where do I start?
Well, you need to know your church. First of all, the church body and what they're going to be accepting of. I was fortunate to, when I lived in the Midwest, we attended, my wife and I and our then new children, attended a non-denominational that had a lot of Baptist underpinnings. So there was a lot of storytelling and a lot of people standing up and sharing testimonials, just the testimonial of the day, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I got to see a lot of, and it's the movement in the audience is palpable when that happens, especially when people are sharing openly. Well, and Texas is just different. I mean, the way we have to be a little bit more creative about how we get through to people. So my advice is to know your church and then formulate a plan for how you get buy-in with your pastoral staff. And that buy-in, I believe, really needs to be public. It can't just be, oh, Rob, yeah, tell stories. Because I got that at the beginning. Oh, so you're going to have a blog? So I'm like, well, I mean, sort of, maybe that's part of it. And that is part of it, tiny part of it. But I need from you, anytime we can, and this goes back to micro nudging, remind people it's so important to tell your story. Share what's happening in this room today with your neighbor. It does not have to be on film. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to stand up in sermon or whatever. You just need to pat somebody in the back and say, this is this thing I'm going through. Can I share with you?
Yeah.
And that's it. But that comes from the staff, I really believe. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that using those stories, not only to encourage the congregation, but almost probably more importantly, encourage people who are not yet a part of your church or the body.
Oh,
When
absolutely.
they can see there is some hope through that. That's why I'm always encouraging churches, hey, those stories, what'd you do with them?
Yeah.
Put them, not only put them on social media, put them on your website where it's relevant and makes sense,
Yeah.
because that's what people they're checking you out. Put them in your Google business profile, upload that video, make it shorter, but upload that video. And just because people that are investigating and checking out your church can see and watch those stories and hopefully be moved to action, call to action.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hey, Rob, who are you looking to, listening to, reading, studying up from that's helping you develop your skills to be an effective storyteller? Are there certain resources that you've leaned into or are leaning into these days?
I read a lot. So I think this is like, how do I become a good writer? Well, you have to read a ton before you ever become a good writer. And I think before you can become a good storyteller, you need to know what makes a good story. And this is kind of where, as a church, sometimes they say, don't ever work at a church, because then you'll see what's behind the curtain, and you don't, and sometimes, you understand the stagecraft and things, and it sort of feels like, so
nobody likes to eat the sausage when they know how it's made, right? Like
yeah, kind of. I mean, it feels so much like I grew up. My mother was in theater, and so I grew up as a child, was sleeping in the the stands or the audience, whatever, in the auditorium when they would have rehearsals at night. And I remember thinking it was so anticlimactic to go to see the opening on Saturday night or whatever of whatever play they were doing, because I've seen this 325,000 times. This is actually not exciting at all.
Yeah.
But I try to obviously read a lot. I also try to follow some particular podcasts that I really enjoy in terms of the quality of storytelling, especially from a Christian perspective. Those are the kinds of things I do. So I read a ton, and I try to follow podcasts that have sort of that story quality.
Can you name any of those podcasts off the top of your head? If you can't, I'll get you to email them to me. We'll put them in the show notes. But if there's anything that you can share. Yeah.
My personal favorite is Compelled. That's Ken Hastings, I believe, does that one. He's here in Texas. Amazingly high quality stories. And he's done a really good job of crafting narrative around the stories, which is sort of how I approach our podcast here at the church. And they're just really well done. And I'm always jealous, because he gets a national reach for story subjects. But very high quality, does it. I think he and his wife produce it on their own, and it's an amazingly well done Christian podcast.
Yeah. The one that comes to my mind, I don't know if you ever listen. What's Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History? Do you ever listen to that?
Sure.
One?
Oh, absolutely.
I love the way that he takes historical stories and tells stories, right? And of course, it's very different. It's very different from what you would be doing in terms of sharing, personal testimonies or life change stories. But there's Malcolm Gladwell is obviously a phenomenal writer as well. But there is something super creative about the way that he gets into certain topics and sort of peels them apart and then uses them to tell a story through his podcast. So that's absolutely one I enjoy. Yeah.
Rob, how can our listeners get a hold of you? They may have some questions, and I'd love it if you could share with them. So how can they get in touch with you?
Sure. You can always email is always really effective, right? My email
you check
here.
If as long as you're a person who checks your email, it's effective.
I check my email. I'm old, so I have an AOL account. My wife and I both do.
Oh my goodness.
See. Always call through the church, but my email here is stories@doxology.church.
Oh, there
that's
you go.
Easy. Stories@doxology.church.
Stories@doxology.church. So I just encourage our listeners, if you have some burning questions that we didn't ask, but you're like, oh, I'd love to learn about this, email Rob. I don't know of very many positions in churches that have what Rob's doing. I know we do them, but it's usually delegated to communications or worship or somebody, but not a person that's dedicated to storytelling. So you may have some more questions. Please ask Rob. I love what you do, Rob, because stories are how we can connect with people and let them know there's hope, right?
Yeah,
And that's
right.
just Jesus has worked in our lives, and through us, we can pass that baton on.
Yeah.
And I think admittedly we're okay at it.
Yeah.
But we need to be a lot better.
Yeah,
The Big
that's
C
right.
Church. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, Rob James from Doxology Bible Church in Fort Worth, Texas. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our guest. It was great to meet you in person when I got the opportunity to do that a couple of months ago, and great to have you on the show. For those of you who have tuned into this week's episode, make sure that you check the show notes for Rob's contact information if you have any follow-up questions for him. Of course, you can always reach out to Jason or me if there's anything that we can do to serve your church. And as a friendly reminder, if you haven't ever left us a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure that you do that. We want 5-star reviews. We don't really want 1-star reviews. If 1 star or 2 stars is what you got for us, just pretend we don't exist and go listen to somebody else's podcast. But if you can leave us a 5-star review, we would appreciate that.
Yep.
Rob, again, thanks for being on the show today. We appreciate you, brother.
Of course. Thank you.